Okay, going live.
Oh, we're on. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll give you a few seconds here to get settled in. In the meantime, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from. Oh, all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Cool. All right. We're 1 minute over now, so I think we can get started. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Jess. I am the product marketing manager here at Metabase. And today we're really lucky to be joined by Ali, who's the founder of Mentat Analytics, a data consulting agency and a Metabase Expert partner. They specialize in supporting high-growth startups build their data teams and stacks. And Ali has also previously worked in data teams at Bird and BuzzFeed. So today, Ali's going to walk us through knowing when you're ready to transition to a data warehouse, the pros and cons of that, and some tips and best practices for a smooth transition. And then we'll open up the floor for a Q&A, which will be the majority of our time today. And it's a really good opportunity to pick Ali's brain on the subject. And so we really encourage you to get involved with questions and add those to the question tab on your right there. For now, again, just take a minute to introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't already, and let us know what you're hoping to learn about today. And you can add any comments and thoughts in the chat throughout as you go. Check out the polls tab as well, and drop in reactions. Those are always cool to see as well. And finally, this call will be recorded and sent to you via email, and you can also find it on YouTube afterwards. So without further ado, Ali, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll hand it over to you to take it away.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Hello, everybody. Great to see everybody participating in the chat. Thank you all for joining the call. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. There's still a minute or so for people to join and catch the main parts of the call. Jess, how's this looking? Looking good? You able to see my screen?
Yeah, perfect.
All right, fantastic. So let me get set up over here. All right, well, let me just test to see if this is working. Okay, great. Well, welcome to the talk, everybody. Thank you again very much for joining, and a big thank you to Jess, Margaret, and the Metabase team for setting this up and for inviting me to speak here. As Jess said, I'm going to talk at first, spend like about 10-15 minutes walking over the topic, the main topic itself, and presenting and talking about that. And then afterwards, we're going to be taking time with like an open floor to answer any questions that you have about warehouses, modern data stacks, and all related topics. As Jess mentioned, I am the founder of Mentat Analytics. We're based in Los Angeles. We're a Metabase expert partner, so we help with training, dashboard building, that kind of stuff, as well as setting up data stacks, data warehouses, and the topics that we covered today. So if you're interested in any help with your stack, especially with Metabase, definitely reach out. So now I know this webinar is called When to Switch to a Data Warehouse, but in order to answer that in like a very understandable way, we actually need to cover a couple of other topics shortly first. So this whole talk is going to be made up of 3 sections. First, we're going to talk about how a warehouse differs from an application database. Then we're going to talk about how a warehouse is part of the modern data stack. And then we're going to really, once we have that appropriate context, we're going to talk about when to switch to a data warehouse. And so, the first part is going to be talking about just like a data warehouse versus a traditional database. So that brings us to the big question. You can think of a warehouse as just a database that's optimized for analytics related use, meaning that the main user of it is a data analyst or a data scientist, and they use it for analytics related needs. So this is as opposed to what is commonly referred to as your application database, which is what your product itself interacts with and stores product and user information in. You may also hear the terms OLTP and OLAP to refer to these 2 types of databases, where OLTP refers to an application database and OLAP refers to a data warehouse. But these terms, they're pretty similar and they're kind of technical. It's hard to kind of memorize which is which. So I like to use just warehouse and application database because it's a bit clearer in the name what it's referring to. So if you think of an app like a Lyft or Uber or any other sort of like ride sharing one, as an example, when you pull up your app, you look at your profile, it pulls information like your age, your payment info, your picture, your address, all these things like that. That's your user information. You can imagine a table called users in your database, which stores information about your users. And your product essentially pulls one whole row of data from this users table. And it's just like your row in it. And it's maybe going to be made up of, say, 20 or 30 columns. And that's what it takes in order to be able to display that page that I showed you before. But now if you pretend that you're like a data analyst at that company, like, at Uber or Lyft or any of these ride sharing ones, and you get asked what a simple question like, what's the average age of our users? In that scenario, you need to pull the entirety of the age column from this whole table in order to be calculate an average. Now, on this fake table that I made here, this column is made up of just like 3 values, but for an app like Lyft or something like that, it's going to be, they've got millions of users. So it's going to be a much, much bigger pull, and it's going to require a lot more processing power. And this sort of difference between how a product interacts with a database versus how a data analyst does it is at the core of the need for a data warehouse. So the warehouse and the application database, they do essentially the same thing, but they're optimized for different purposes. The warehouse pulls data in a different type of way, stores it in a different type of way that's more analyst friendly. The database stores it and uses it in a more product friendly way. There's other reasons here as well. For example, you don't want to put too much of a load on your product's database because then it can slow down the product. But there's other ways around that by like creating what's called a read replica or things of the sort. But generally speaking, the main difference has to be with essentially what the two are optimized for. And an analogy that I found very useful to explain something like that is to think of cars. Just think of like a regular sedan, like a Toyota, on the left, and versus like the truck that's on the right here. Now, both are cars, both have generally the same function, but they're optimized for different things. Neither one is better than the other as a whole. One's better if you're taking a road trip, you're going to be on the road for a long time, and the other one's better if you're working at a construction site and you need to carry around equipment. At the same time, if you're doing something really simple, like just going to a store or to buy something, or like just going to your friend's house, you can technically use either of them, and it's totally fine. But when you get to more, advanced use cases, you want to switch to the right tool. And that's at the core of what we have with databases versus warehouses. And examples of sort of the most well-known data warehouses are Redshift, which is Amazon's, BigQuery, which is Google's, and Snowflake, which is a third party that can go on either stack. And examples of application databases are things like Amazon RDS, MySQL, and so on. And Postgres, if you're familiar with it, is a type of database that can be configured essentially to be both types based on your need. Not at the same time, you can just set up different instances of it being different from one. So that's our section about how is a warehouse even different from a database? Why is it a separate thing? And then we come into how does a data warehouse fit into your data stack as a whole? So we use this term modern data stack that's become popular in the past couple of years, maybe past few years. And this is what I want to explain here. A data warehouse is usually set up as part of a larger set of tools, and all of them are focused on allowing your team to have top-notch analytics. So this set of tools are generally referred to as the modern data stack, and the warehouse is at the center of it. Remember that the warehouse doesn't fully replace the original database. It's set up alongside it because the product still needs to interact with its own database. So for example, you will have your product set up on a MySQL application database, and then you'll have BigQuery as the warehouse for your analytics needs set up alongside it. Now, your user data and product data is still going to your application database first. So you need a way to replicate that data to a warehouse for analytics purposes. That's why we have ETL tools. ETL is short for extract, transform, and load. It's just a fancy way of saying it takes data from one place and copies it or moves it to somewhere else. So when you set up your warehouse, you typically use an ETL tool to actually put data in it so that it can be used. And I say typically because you can also write your own custom scripts that run periodically and do this for you. But as ETL tools are becoming better and easier to use, more and more use cases are moving over to them instead of having custom scripts. So the ETL tool takes data from your application database as well as your third-party tools and replicates it to your data warehouse. The most well-known ETL tool is like Fivetran, but my personal favorite is Hivo, and there's a bunch of different brands. You can find all of them online, but these are just sort of like a couple of the well-known ones in that space. And then once that data is pumped into your warehouse in its raw form, you need to make some changes to it to make it more analytics friendly. For example, you could remove columns that store sensitive data like passwords. You can make regular snapshots of the table so you can analyze how the data changes over time and things like that. And for that, you need tools that let you schedule jobs for creating new tables, testing to make sure you have good data, and so on. And that's where data modeling comes in. And the most popular tool in that category is DBT, and there's a few other ones, but that's sort of the most well-known one that you probably heard of. And then, of course, when your data is ready to analyze, and you need to do sort of like the main thing that you set out to do, which is to gain insights into your business and how well it's doing. Then you need a business intelligence tool so you can build dashboards, you can save your queries, you can share insights, and you can do essentially all the main things that you did all this hard work to actually be able to do. You need a tool to do that with. And that's where Metabase comes in, right? Metabase gives you all of these abilities to dig deeper into your data on your own with SQL, whatever you need. And this, so to recap, this is what is at the core of the modern data stack. You have a warehouse at the center where you store all your data. You have an ETL tool whose job is to move data from different places to the warehouse or from the warehouse back to the other tools. A transformation tool for cleaning the raw data that's pumped to the warehouse, and a BI tool to take all of that clean data and turn it into useful insights about your business. And yes, there are other components that can be added here, like a data catalog, reverse ETL, things like that. But right now, sort of like the what's at the core of the data stack, the modern data stack, is the tools that I mentioned over here in this picture. So this, if you, probably like a useful thing to take a screenshot of this diagram just to keep that in your archives for something like this. And so now that we have some context, we know how the warehouse differs from the analytics from an application database. It's about what they're optimized for. And then we also understand how the warehouse fits into the modern data stack. That's with a BI tool, it's with an ETL tool, it's with a data modeling tool, but the warehouse is at the center. Now we can start talking about when it's time to actually switch to a data warehouse from your application database, which is the core topic that we want to discuss here. Now, when you start out, it's completely fine to not have a warehouse. That's the norm. Everybody starts without one. Whatever your regular database you have, you don't have to wait for a modern data site before you start getting insights. As soon as you have your application database set up and it has data in it, you can just add Metabase on there and get going. So remember, this whole talk is about when to switch to a warehouse and not like why you should start with a warehouse from the beginning. We want to talk about when to switch to it. It's not like a warehouse is set up just by itself, right? Like that's why we covered this whole previous section. We covered the other things that typically come with a warehouse. At the very least, you need a way to replicate your data to the application from the application database to the warehouse. So early on, don't wait for all that. Just kind of get started on going with insights until you reach the right time to switch. Which brings us to the $1 million question around when should my company switch to a data warehouse? And now, I wish I could tell you that there's like a very specific point in the company's life cycle, which it's the perfect time to switch, like a single factor that determines the ideal time. But like most things, it's a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more complicated than that. There are a few different signs of when it's a good time to switch, a few different decision-making factors, and we're going to cover them all one by one right now. So the first sign that it's a good time to switch is query performance. So remember that the main thing about a warehouse is that it's built for analytical loads and analytical usage. So when you get to the point that all your queries are taking a very long time to load, or they just end up timing out because they can't process your queries, that's a pretty good sign that it's time to start moving to a warehouse. This is actually one of the things that ends up being sort of like the most common tip, that it's time. Because yeah, you can sort of increase the capacity of your database, but that only works so well. Like at some point, you'll notice that it's going to be very expensive if you want to upgrade the capacity, and still doesn't really give you that much of a return. So that's usually the point. That's the most easy tell that it's like, oh, okay, I think we need to move to something that's specifically made for this. So query performance is the main thing to look for. And then the second is the need for transformed data. So sometimes, the data in your application database just isn't good enough for your analytics needs. A common example of this is tables where the rows of data get regularly overwritten by your product. So your analytics team needs access to the historical values, but the product doesn't. A great example of this is subscription data. Imagine you're like a B2B SaaS company, you offer a subscription. Like your product only needs to know if someone is currently a subscriber or not. That's all it needs to be able to display to them the right tools, the right features. But an analyst wants to know if that person had a subscription, then churned, or how long were they subscriber for, that kind of thing. This type of historical information that the product itself doesn't really need. So you need to take snapshots of the data periodically and store them in a new table with a column that says, like, when is the snapshot from? This is the type of thing that data modeling tools like dbt do, and tools like that are built for a warehouse. And they generally, they're like the only thing they can integrate with is a warehouse, because that's what a warehouse is built for. And not to mention that kind of table usually ends up getting really big really quick, so you end up running into the performance issues that I mentioned with your queries if you let a few of those tables get big. So that's the second sign, right? It's data transformation needs. You need to change it in a way that you can your analysts can use it. The third sign is the need for blending multiple data sources. I'm sure your startup uses lots of different tools. For analytics, you might be using like Mixpanel, Google Analytics, or anything like that. For customer management, you might be using like Salesforce or HubSpot. For customer communication, you might use like Braze and Customer IO, and then you like run ads on Facebook, Google, and Twitter. This is very common for folks to have just a lot of different tools. Like we sit down and make a list of it, of all the things that you use and add useful data. The list gets pretty big, sort of like early on in your company lifecycle. And as a data analyst, as an analytics engineer, and any of these data roles, at some point, for sure, you're going to be asked to start answering questions that require you to blend data from a lot of these different sources. Like if you want to know, hey, what's the ROI for my Google ads, then you'll need to blend data from Google ads along with data about how much the users that came from there were spending in your app, or like how long were they subscriber for. And in that scenario, your application database only has the data about the spending in the app, but not the data about ad performances, because that's sitting in Google's database, not yours. So in order to do analysis on both, you need to get them both in the same place first, and your data warehouse is that place. The rest of your data stacks help with this as well. You can use your ETL to connect to Google Ads on one end and the data warehouse on the other end, and pipe that data in. And you'll notice that most ETL tools won't even have an application database necessarily that they support as a destination for piping data into. They just accept warehouses, because that's what warehouses are built for. So this type of blending of different sources, whether it's like Google Ads in your product or like Salesforce and something, like all of this stuff, this is the point at which it's usually a good time to move to a warehouse, because the warehouse is where you can blend things from multiple sources instead of just your product's data. And we had 3 signs that we discussed about, like signs where you should, but there's also one important sign of when it might not be a good time, and that's why there's a little asterisk. That's the number 4 here, and that sign is that you don't have someone who can own your data stack. Keeping a modern data stack in good shape takes time and takes skill. You need to write and maintain jobs that like transform and test the data. You need to document your tables. You need to build these data models, code snippets and variables that you save, all sorts of things. And you have to like increase or decrease your warehouse size if you're on less managed databases like Redshift. So it's really important that you either have someone in your team that knows how to do all of that, or you work with an external party like an agency that does. It's generally not a good idea to get an advanced stack built out if you're just gonna sort of like leave it on its own after it's set up. And this is like one of the, I guess you could call it, downsides of switching to the warehouse, and that it does require, that setup requires more maintenance than early on, where you can just put like your Metabase, your BI tool on the application database and get going. And the application database is generally like managed by your engineers, so you don't have to worry about it very much. So if you meet the other three requirements, then it's definitely time to switch to a warehouse, but you should also make sure that you are able to meet the fourth requirement, either by hiring somebody full-time or working with a consultant or agency or somebody who has experience with it. So we're going to recap the points that we discussed about, when is the right time to move to a warehouse and a modern data stack. First item was query performance. So if your queries are taking a long time to load or keep timing out, that means you've probably reached your database limits. Data transformation needs is the second one. Sometimes your data is just not good enough in its current format for you to like answer your most important questions. So you have to schedule jobs to transform it, test it, and so on. For that, you want a data warehouse so you can combine it with data modeling tools and get yourself set up with clean data. Then we have the blending of data sources, which, in order to answer your questions, you need to pull in data from sources other than your product. This is ads data, CRM data, comms data, anything like that. To do this, you add all that data in a warehouse and then blend them together using a tool like Metabase to view the results. And then ownership, which, as well as not least, not planning to leave the stack on its own after it's been set up. You have an analyst or a contractor, and just somebody you work with. So that's that. That's your general answer to when you should switch to a data warehouse. We covered all the different parts leading up to it, and this is sort of like the main takeaway from it. So thank you all very much for bearing with me. That wraps up the presentation portion of this webinar. So now I'm going to open up the floor to more questions, and yes, Margaret, I'll hand this over to you, and I'll be here to answer. And thank you very much for the kind words, Corey, in the chat. I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you so much, Ali. Yeah, I love the metaphor for with cars, comparing it to your database and warehouse. That really kind of brings it to life. Yeah, and the blending data sources definitely is something that resonated with me as well. It's something I'm always bugging our data.
Yeah.
And we do have a question already. So Sergey asks, do you have any recommendations on how to choose a data warehouse?
It's a great question. Yeah, so I would say there's, as always, there's a few different things that factor into it. So one of the things that people tend to use as a factor is just which stack their engineering work is done on. So they would like to typically like remain within the same platform. So a lot of times if someone's already on AWS, they're like, hey, we don't want to go outside of AWS. So they just go with AWS's offering, which is Redshift. In this case, that's their data warehouse. But there's also the third option, which is like Snowflake, which can go on either AWS or Google Stack. Snowflake is generally considered to be sort of like the highest performing warehouse, but it does require more specialized knowledge to set up than the others. So I would say, if you are willing to take the time to really learn how to set it up correctly, or somebody that can come in and help you with that, then Snowflake is a good one there, but it does require sort of, like I said, like specialized knowledge. BigQuery, which is Google's one, tends to be the one that is, I would say, in my view, sort of like the best balance, in that it's pretty easy to set up. It has a cheap starting tier, or that it's pretty useful. And it comes with other data tools that it syncs with that makes things easier. They have like Google Sheets that comes with it that you can like connect it to really easily. So that's that. But overall, it really comes down to like, what do you have on your team that who on your team is familiar with what? What does the pricing look like? What is your engineering stack built in? Trying to maintain compatibility with it is usually helpful. And then just some of the details of each warehouse. like I said, Snowflake sort of like upsize and downsizes on its own, which is convenient, but requires more setup upfront. BigQuery is sort of like a place between Redshift and Snowflake in that it is somewhat managed. It does upsize and downsize, but it's doesn't sort of change size and scale as well as Snowflake does. And Redshift generally was the one where you could just kind of set like a specific price by purchasing a specific number of nodes and like have it stay there. So it's the least managed of them. So it kind of falls in that spectrum, and you got to decide which one you want to pick. And again, sorry that this wasn't like a very specific, like, hey, this is the way to pick. But honestly, none of these have a clear answer where it's just like, this is the way to pick. It's a combination of multiple different factors.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, super comprehensive. A lot to consider there. Ryan asks, how do you think about pricing for data warehouses? Do you normally pay by query or an all-you-can-eat type of scenario?
Yes, I'm not familiar with any that have this, essentially, like you said, like an all-you-can-eat type scenario. The closest thing to that is so traditional like Redshift, the way Redshift did things, and I say the way they did because they've now offered additional ways to do this. Redshift generally allowed for more predictability around price because you would essentially buy like a node, which is a node brings a certain amount of storage and processing power to it. So you would purchase a certain amount of certain type of node, and that has a fixed monthly price. And then you would use it as much as you wanted, but then if you sort of like reached its capacity, your queries would start slowing down and you would have to manually go in and shift that up. So if you're really price conscious and you're like, I don't want to go above this number regardless, then that's the best approach there, to just go with that, get a fixed amount of capacity. And I guess that's a little bit closer to like that kind of all you said there, but it's just more likely to slow down and hit its capacity there. And then BigQuery and Snowflake, they're usage based and storage based, so they're gonna fluctuate more, but they also are more unlikely to like slow down in performance because of that. So that's always going to be the trade-off. You have to sort of, you can't both have a fixed price and have the performance be great regardless of how much you use it. Either you have a fixed price and then the performance will slow as you reach your capacity, or you pay per query, per processing power really is what you're doing, and per storage, which is what Snowflake and BigQuery are, in which case it can sort of go up and down. And you can do estimations, like they always tell you, like, hey, per query per this amount of time, and you can do rough estimations, but really you only end up getting sort of like the real answer once you've used it for a month or two and see the information. By the way, Jess, we're seeing a bunch of questions in the chat section. I think there's also a separate question section. Should we, I'll leave that up to you. I just want to call it out that there's a bunch there.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm seeing those come in as well. Yeah, if you can use the questions tab, that's a little bit better, but I'll be keeping an eye on both. I'll just jump back into the questions tab now. So Francisco asks, what about data warehouse and ETL recommendations that run on premise?
Honestly, I'm not really familiar with the premise. On premise. Oh, okay, I thought that was like a different product. Sorry, my bad. Premise. I believe that you can run most of these. So I don't think you can do BigQuery on premise. I believe maybe does Snowflake have it? Honestly, I'm not totally sure off the top of my head if that has it. I do know that there are a bunch of open source ETL options. I know that Airbyte has an open source version that you can take and run it on premise. Stitch is based off of an ETL tool called Singer, which is also open source and can be run on premise. But then the warehouses themselves, I don't know if any of the big three can be run there. Maybe Snowflake. But one thing that you can do, remember I said earlier that Postgres can actually be configured to be both types. So you can take a Postgres database and you can set it up to be OLAP, as it's called, which is basically like a data warehouse type, and then run that on premise. So just off the top of my head, you could use Airbyte, which is a pretty cheap tool that's like good, high quality, but still cheap and has good connectors. And you could use like Postgres warehouse as well. And someone in the chat just mentioned that they work for a company that has a data warehouse that runs on premise. So you can hit them up too to talk about that.
Awesome. Okay, next one from Emil. Can you recommend Apache NiFi? NiFi, I hope I'm saying that right, in combination with MS SQL database as a warehouse for a small business?
Very honestly, I am not familiar with Apache NiFi. There are a lot of tools on the market, a lot in every category. Unfortunately, each person is only familiar with some of them. So I can't tell you in good conscience, like go with that or don't. But a small business's needs, when it comes to like, is this thing good for a small business? It really usually only comes down to two things. So that's this. I'm going to tell you just sort of like how to decide, as opposed to like whether this tool specifically is good. If something is going to be incompatible with a small business, it's usually for two things. One is that its starting price is too high. And so like it's just not worth it to start paying for it when you don't have a ton of data, since it's a small business, or it just requires a lot of maintenance, again, which is something that a capacity that like a small business usually doesn't have. So look at those two things with these tools, and go based on that, and try to put in something that, like, even if you leave, somebody else is able to pick up and continue. If you pick something very specialized that you create, it's like, okay, you'll create it for them, you'll maintain it, but then you might end up going to a different company and they'll be stuck with something that like nobody else knows how to use, and that's going to make it hard for them. So that's that. Like, if I had to take like a what I think was probably like good from the warehouses that I know that's best for a small business, I'd probably go with BigQuery, because it's fairly managed, so it doesn't require a lot of setup. It has some like job scheduling features that come with it, and it also has like a pretty good like free tier that covers a lot of use case. So that would be my recommendation. But I'm sure Apache NiFi is a good one as well.
Yeah, that's great advice to consider who comes next as well.
Yeah.
Okay, Corey says, we're working on making predictive models on our data, on our application data. I've been debating on if functionality like this would be best suited for a data warehouse or to build it within our application itself. What would you recommend we do?
Right. So this is typically done more within the warehouse, but so I see. I'm just like looking at questions, see if there's more detail here. So the predictive models that are on your application data, and maybe Corey, you can answer here in the chat. I'm looking at it. Can you tell me if you plan on using the output of the predictive models within the product itself, or is it going to be like for your business? Are you displaying the output to the users, or are you displaying it to your colleagues and yourself? Based on that, there's different things. If you're displaying it to the users, then it does need to go in the product, most likely. You would ideally like to have the capability to do both. If you want to do both, I would say it's more likely that you would want to do it, I guess, in the application database itself, so that you can display it in the product. Because when you put it in the warehouse, like, then you have to do something to bring it back to the application database. So in that case, like, yeah, maybe in the product itself, so that you can display it to them in the product and then put it in the warehouse. But I will give a call out here, which is that embedded analytics can be done from the warehouse as well. That's actually one of the things that Metabase's Pro like version is for. It's for allowing that kind of like both row-based access and customization that's used for embedded analytics. So you could either put it in your product, so you can display the output to the users, and then replicate all of that to the warehouse where you use it for your BI. You could put it in the warehouse, which it's probably going to be easier, honestly, to put the outputs in the warehouse itself. It's just the displaying to users that then makes it difficult. You would have to find a way to take it from the warehouse then back to your application database. So check to make sure the ETL tool you're using is compatible with that. And then the alternative option would be that you build everything in your warehouse, and then you build your dashboards using a tool that supports row level access and like customizability, which is what I mentioned, like Metabase Pro does. And then you embed those analytics within your product, which is actually what a lot of folks do, because dealing with essentially showing just the data that each user needs to see versus giving them access to the whole table is one of the things that can be difficult there. But so those are the different options. Like based on the details, you can sort of decide. But you can go either way. Great. Looks like that answered it.
Awesome. We've got space for a few more questions if anyone's got any burning topics they want to add.
I'll mention something real quick. Igor pointed something out, which is totally correct, just that Redshift serverless is also on the market. So yes, Igor, you're totally correct. That's why I said this is how Redshift used to offer only things, which is that I was mentioning Redshift is sort of like fixed price with fixed performance, but they've recently, as Igor pointed out, also added serverless as an option, which is basically more like more manageable, more managed databases where you pay per query. They have it both on Redshift, and they also have a separate service called Athena that has been serverless from the beginning and has been around for a few years. So I just want to call that out. Thank you for pointing that out, Igor.
Yeah, love when that kind of interaction comes in.
For sure.
Cool. It looks.
You can also take Aria. Yeah, I was gonna say if you have just general questions about the stack as a whole, I'm happy to answer those as well. Once we have time, I'm here, so might as well.
Cool. I'll drop in a question while we're.
Great.
If anyone has anything else. I was wondering if you have any specific examples of scenarios where switching to a data warehouse was beneficial for teams or companies.
Yeah. So I was hired once by a company to do an audit. I'm not sure if I'm like allowed to share their name, so I won't. But they were a company that did deliveries, like really fast deliveries, like in like 15-20 minutes, and they use like electric scooters for it. They're based in LA, and they hired me to do like an audit of their what we call them just these data audits, which is basically they bring me in to just look at everything and tell them how they can improve it, because they have a lot of issues and they don't know where it's coming from. It's actually a popular service. And yeah, they had a lot of these signs that I mentioned. Like the main thing was like their queries were just very, very slow. They were actually Metabase users as well, and their queries were just timing out and slow so much. So I saw that, I'm like, okay, well, this is definitely a thing and they had already upgraded the capacity on their database a bunch of times and they were still running pretty slow. They had a bunch of different sources where they were running ads. Like they didn't have Salesforce or anything like that. They didn't have any data tools, but they had a bunch of different places where they were running ads, and then these people were coming in and purchasing products. And because it's an operation-based business, it was really like they had to spend a lot of money to run the business for each client and to serve them. So they really wanted to make sure that when they spend on their advertising, they're getting something in return. And in order to do that, they wanted to blend like payment data and all of that from the product with their ads in order to build things. And they actually finally had all of these signs. They usually happen at the same time. They also had issues with like snapshots that they were missing because their inventory kept updating. Like they had a table of all their available products, and the table only kept recent products, like current products, not old ones. And so they couldn't look at historical data to see like what had been available and what had not been. So they really checked all of these boxes. And so for them, I just like kind of recommended and laid out a whole modern data stack for them with warehouse, ETL, all of these things, because it was very clear that they were just reaching the limits of what they had.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a great example. And we have another question now from Ryan. Not sure if you followed, but any headlines out of Snowflake and Databricks conference this week that you thought were interesting? So a lot of talk about AI, LLMs tied to data.
Oh, very cool. I will be honest and say that I have not followed the conference. I know these conferences happen a lot, and generally I find myself not wanting to sit down and listen to the whole thing. I'll just end up getting the summaries through like one of my friends. But yeah, AI is sort of like, I think I've been hit up by maybe 8 different founders of like companies that are building a service where the AI interacts with the warehouse, that they hit me up on LinkedIn and are like, hey, do you want to start offering our product to your customers? I'm like, no, not really. And so yeah, that's definitely a hot topic. I really think the jury's still kind of out on it. really got to see, like, there is good approaches to them, bad approaches. I really have to like, I've like with everybody else, I've been very impressed with what something like ChatGPT does, but I've also seen it a lot of times, like with data. Data has this problem, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, you're all data analysts. It's a lot easier to make mistakes that don't get seen in data than it is with something like just regular engineering or regular text, right? Like regular text, you read it and you see if there's a mistake in it. Engineering, the product breaks, like you QA, you just try, you want it to do certain things, it doesn't do that thing, the output looks different, so you're like, oh, this is wrong. With data, the numbers could be off enough that it's incorrect, but not off enough that you're like, oh, this is clearly wrong. And that capacity of it doesn't fit very well with a very black box approach, which is what AI does. So this is a fundamental issue that, like, all of these companies that talk about how AI is going to like come in and fix everything for data, they don't, it seems like they kind of like don't really address it. So it really comes down to like performance. We have to see if they're able to somehow do that. There was one tool I saw, I don't remember its name, where like when you use AI to ask something in the warehouse, it would sort of lay out its whole thought process before giving you the answer, which I thought was a good approach. I think something like that is good. But what I've also seen is that AI will also make up a thought process that's not real. I've had to do that with me when I've tried it before. So yeah, like I'm excited about the possibilities, but I'm also apprehensive because I could see where it can go wrong a lot. And I think we just kind of have to wait and see what the products on the market look like. I do recommend that all of you do familiarize yourself with the ways that it can cut down on the time that you spend writing scripts, both queries and scripts, because it is very helpful with that. I use it myself, and it does really improve productivity there. Just don't rely on it entirely.
Yeah, that's a super fascinating topic, that kind of like QA part of things and the black box thinking.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
that was a great question, by the way. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, really good. Cool. We're coming up on time here, but yeah, I think we haven't seen any new questions pop in. If anyone has any last minute thoughts they want to kind of sneak in before we wrap it up, or Ali, if you have any kind of anything to cover.
No, not really. I'm just looking at the chat to see if anything. I think earlier on, Corey had asked if the recording is going to be shareable because they want to share with their team. And yes, Jess and Margaret said earlier, yeah, it is going to be shareable. I think you're gonna. Are you just gonna send out the link or just put it on YouTube first, or what's that approach there?
The link will go out via email, and we'll also load it up on YouTube as well.
Great. I see that Ryan is typing. Okay, just thank you. Yeah, thank you for joining, Ryan. Yeah, I don't really have that much more to say. I think we got really good questions. Yeah, in general, like, look, there's always going to be a lot of different tools. Like, there's just 100 tools in every different category. I know it can be confusing to know which one to pick, and it's made even harder by the fact that it's very hard to find an unbiased article that compares anything to anything. It's like every time you look at like this tool versus this other tool, it's just like the creators of those tools have written articles that pretend to be unbiased.
Yeah.
And it's just like funny. It's like, why are you pretending? Like, we can see the URL on this blog. We know it's written by you. Your logo's on the top of the page. So it can definitely be confusing. There are a lot of different tools, but ultimately, like, do a little bit of research, and then just try it out. Like, just get something, slap it on there, try it out. If it's not good, you can always switch to something later. It's okay. Just more, it's more important to make that progress than to get stuck with 100 different options, just trying to decide and not being able to. And you can always reach out to myself or any of other countless analytics agencies that work with these tools, and they'll make you a recommendation. Just always make sure to ask if they're like in a situation where they might get sort of like kickbacks from the company if they recommend a specific tool. So just be aware of that when you ask for recommendations.
Yeah, and you can also you can find Ali's consultancy, Mentat, on our Metabase Experts page. Yeah. So
yeah, I didn't share a link because I'm like, everybody Googles it anyway. No one's gonna remember a link, but Mentat Analytics. And yes, for those of you who might be fans of the Dune book series, it is a reference to that. I always end up getting a message on LinkedIn after every webinar when they're like, is that what the name is about? I'm like, yes. Okay.
Cool. All right. Well, yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. And thank you again so much, Ali, for an excellent presentation and really thoughtful Q&A. Thank you to everyone for joining. And again, for your really great comments and questions. We hope to see you at the next webinar.
Okay. Cool. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Jess and Margaret, again for setting this up.
Thank you. All right. Take care.